Hi, my name is Tammy Deweever, and I'm here with world-renowned astrologer Ron Watson, who's also my teacher, and I'm going to ask some questions about charts because I look at charts as well, and I have questions. So I'll ask him what he thinks about some things. The first question I have is, Ron, I know you said that the sun represents the ego in the chart, but can you explain some of the aspects that the sun might make to certain planets that would bring the ego out?
Thank you for the introduction. I essentially believe that the sun is the reflector, if you would, of who you really want to shine the most as. And it represents your ego need. And that means that if you are, it might be negative, as for example a square to the sun could be a negative energy, even though it's the closest aspect, and that's what I look for in the ego need of a chart. The closest aspect to that sun. In the case of my own life, my own chart, I can speak well of it because I've experienced the Mars square sun, which is not the most positive aspect. And it also, since Mercury and my sun are only a degree apart, it squares also Mercury. That means, in effect, that I've always, particularly when I was younger, was always kind of proud and braggadocio about my martial arts ability, my fighting ability, my ability to defend myself in situations that required that, and would find a great amount of enthusiasm, if you would, for describing those battles, and feeling very proud and noble about that. And that's ego need. That's ego talking, really, and I've seen that in a lot of people's charts. I have a student which you have met before, and it's named Tim, and Tim has a child that has autism. Excuse me, it took me a minute, and one of those senior moments. But anyway, he has autism, and much to his surprise, the thing that opened his son up the most was his taking him to martial arts classes and learning to defend himself. And
So he has that aspect
he
as
has
well,
that
the
aspect.
sun square Mars?
Exactly, So it doesn't have to be necessarily square, but it has to be the closest aspect to your sun. And in his case, the boy had that, and when he recognized that after I explained to him the ego needs, because he said he's so proud of his accomplishments, and it's opened him up more than anything else he's done. And I said, isn't it a marvelous thing to have astrology as a tool to be able to see the need of that child and to be able to move in a direction that's going to be rehabilitative for that child. So this is one of the things. The other thing, Mars is squaring my Mercury, and I can talk about that. We don't have to just talk about Mars, but Mercury is in education and knowledge and learning and speaking and things like that. And of course I shine a lot when I'm on stage, if I'm in front of a camera. I can very much articulate myself pretty well in that scenario, so I believe that that's another ego need for me. I find my ego satisfied a lot by being out there speaking, lecturing, teaching.
And is that because the sun is conjunct your Mercury?
It's squaring Mars, but
okay, both of them together.
They're exactly. So we have two planets that are interacting there, the sun and we have Mercury. But because it is conjunct the sun, we're bringing those energies together. The ego need and Mercury. Mercury never gets further than 15 degrees.
Right.
I think from the sun, it's almost always close to the sun. But in my case, it's 1 degree. So.
Okay, good information to know.
All right.
Sometimes I freeze when I initially see a chart. Don't know where to start as far as helping the person.
Right.
What do you think we should look at? First in a chart, second, third, etc.
I always tell my students, go for the juggler. And what I mean by that is go for the the strongest and the most apparent energies you see in that chart. And you're going to get those not from reading the sun in Sagittarius, or your moon is in Gemini, that type of thing. That'll give you information, but the real chart interpretation comes with the aspects, and particularly the hard aspects. That's why I say go for the juggler. Go for the most striking, most powerful, and very often the most negative aspect in that chart, because it's something I can talk about. A person has Venus trine Jupiter and say, you're lucky in money, and you benefit, and you'll expand your wealth in life if you're, in terms of accumulation and things like that. It's kind of blue sky stuff. But if I look at a chart and I see a cross in that chart, and I go right there to that first and say, maybe they have, let's say, heavy afflictions to the moon. I know that there's a lot of emotional problems in that person's life, okay, and particularly as a child, okay. So, and if they have, let's say they have an aspect between Saturn and Mars, very hard planets to deal with those aspects, if they're hard aspects. And then those aspects represent very much, in the case of Mars, injury usually, also often Saturn too is injury. Saturn is injuries to the skeletal frame, the teeth, the bones. It can be skin problems. Saturn moves your skin, those types of things. One of my students, I recall, had a serious issue with psoriasis, and he had terrible Saturn afflictions in his chart. So these are things that you can spot pretty quickly. And the reason I say go for the juggler is because, if I'm sitting down with a client and I see that they've got Mars afflicting Venus, for example, I know they've had a lot of injuries and a lot of problems in marriage or in relationships. Mm-hmm. And so I go right there, because they know right away this is not a game.
Right.
That I know what I'm talking about, and I can actually go to the core of the root problems of their chart right away, and that's significant for a person. And it takes away the blue sky stuff,
the fluff.
Yeah, it's good. I like it, the fluff. The people that sit there and I've been at psychic fairs where I've been reading at a table, listening to the table next to me, and sometimes I'm alarmed by just forgive me, but the charade that's being played with their words and what they're saying. So I believe you should go right for the most critical aspect in that chart, and don't hedge on that. Go for it. Go at it. Go right away to it. If a person has Mars-Saturn afflictions, they got a lot of trouble with forgiving. Okay, Mars is anger, and Saturn is resentment. Saturn represents living in the past. Okay, mm-hmm. That's what it's all about. So if I did a chart for a client who, her boyfriend, he had this square Mars-Saturn, and the moon, and I recall telling her this man's going to be very controlling, which Saturn does that, and he's also going to be very unforgiving if you do anything to anger him. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. She was communicating with another person, and he went through her messages on her phone and mm-hmm. discovered this. So there's the control. He wanted to find out exactly, controlling, and then he never forgave that. He couldn't forgive it because he's always looking to the past. Yes. And the two words or the few things that destroys relationships more than anything else is you always and you never, which is I don't forgive you now and I didn't forgive you then. So that's the process that Saturn does. It's always looking back. It's the past. Jupiter's very forward-looking. Jupiter's the optimism. It's the faith. Saturn's pessimism, and it's analytical in a negative way. It wants to divide and separate and be critical. If it goes back to the scriptures, Satan, the devil, the serpent is Saturn. It was the accuser of our brethren. He who accused our brethren before God both day and night. So when you see Saturn afflictions, somebody's carrying two things. They're carrying guilt, number one, because that's self-accusing. And from self-accusing, from this spirit of guilt, comes something else. And that's called finding fault in others, okay? Scapegoating, back to Capricorn, mm-hmm. the goat, scapegoating. Let's find someone else to blame for my problems, because it's really not me that's the fault, it's everybody else. Okay, enough on that subject. So. All right, you have other questions? Go ahead.
Yes. How do you tell the difference in choosing what facet of life a planet will affect in a particular house. Like for instance, we say the sixth house represents your work environment or servants, even small animals. When you're doing a chart, how do you choose which one it represents?
Wow, that's a little bit difficult, because for me it's not looking at one planet ever in a chart. It's the collective whole. The difference between a good astrologer and one that's struggling with it is that they tend not to have a holistic view of the chart. They don't, it's like a computer. If you get a computer readout on a chart, it takes this aspect and that planet, and it gives a meaning, right?
Yeah, it does.
But an astrologer is going to do something more. He's going to integrate all that. And it's in the synthesis of that chart that the true reader gets something from it. Because there's maybe something offsetting something that you might read independently as being negative, but something else offsets that. I find that we have to approach astrology in a very holistic, integrated way to value and to get anything from it. And the more we can see that whole and see that unifying force that's speaking to us from that chart, because the chart does speak and it has a message, and if you can get the core meaning from that chart, then you're going to start reading very powerfully. I see often people will try to example one of my students in Sweden that I Skyped with for 10 sessions in 10 weeks, 2-hour sessions. She first thing she wanted to do when she sat down is find a career interest in the chart, and that's all good and well directed, but it's not really the most important thing. The most important thing is to first look at the chart as a whole. Find out what the real psychological factors are in that person's life. They may have some planet in the 6th house of work and service that is indicative of a potential direction, but they may not be psychologically equipped to deal with that, because the whole chart is telling you something else. That they have a lot of issues that are relationship-wise, that are getting along with other people, and maybe the ability to work harmoniously with others is going to conflict with that. So we have to look at the whole chart.
Okay. And final question.
Okay.
How do you deal with skeptics?
I don't.
Okay, that was quick. Maybe we have time for another.
Well, the reason I said that so kind of quickly is because, there's a saying, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. I find it a waste of time to try to convince anybody of something or argue with them or debate with them on a subject that I'm very familiar with, which they're not. And if they are familiar with it, then they're not going to be arguing with me if they really understood the science. So for me, it's not about convincing other people of anything. I have a book out called The Greatest Story Never Told, which of course embodies the relationship between astrology and Christianity. If you get a fundamental Christian that's been convinced that astrology is something they shouldn't be looking at, there's no way you're going to convince them otherwise. And I don't want to. Because my opinion about that is that if a person believes in say they're a fundamental Christian, and they eschew astrology and they think this is negative, my thoughts are this: I don't want to change them. I just say to them, listen, if you believe this way and this is your faith, live it, and be a good person and live it. But for me to try to convert them and change their mind and make them believe like I believe isn't going to work. I've had people approach me with their beliefs. Seventh-day Adventist come to my door, or Jehovah Witness comes and they knock on, and they want to give me their pamphlets and all. And my response to them is this, and it's a simple scripture. And the scripture says, "In this ye shall know if you're my disciples or not, in that you have love one for another." Not that you attend a church on 4th and Main, you see, or this church or that, or eat fish on Friday, or worship on Saturday instead of Sunday. It's not about that. It's about how much love you have in your life, in your heart towards others, but you can't love others unless you love yourself. The scripture says, what does it say? A man who loves his wife loves himself. Mm-hmm. He can't love his wife unless he loves himself. You have to have that sense of worth. That's why when you see times that are very difficult for economically, there's more abuse towards women. okay? Because the men are not,
They don't love themselves.
they don't love themselves because they're not being creatively, constructively, they're the hunter, the gatherers, they're not getting anything out there. So what happens? They take it out on the first person they can, that's their wife. Anyway, enough of this. But this is a marvelous, marvelous tool. It opens the door to a great amount of really profound understanding about yourself and about others. And people say, well, you spend so much time looking at your own chart. It's so self-preoccupied. I say, look, you need that. You need to understand yourself before you can understand others. You need to love yourself before you can love others. So spend a lot of time on your own chart. Learn about yourself. Therefore, you'll be able to learn about others. That's how I see it. Anyway, thank you for your questions.
Oh, no problem. Anytime, Ron.
All right. Great.
Okay, well, thank you, Ron. This has been a great session. Hopefully we'll have more where I can ask more questions. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Well, thank you.